Welcome to the Midday Connect. We're glad to have our presenter, Dan Baird, today from Wrench AI. And as I do, I asked ChatGPT to do its best on an intro. So Dan Baird, co-founder and product lead / whiz at Wrench AI, cutting edge AI-driven personalization platform. Drop down because that was kind of boring. Whether it's enriching and blending data, predicting customer insights, or revolutionizing account-based sales, Dan and the team at Wrench AI are here to help businesses thrive with the power of AI. So Dan, without further GPT ado, take it away.
Yeah, thank you kindly. Let me make sure I'm sharing the right screen, actually. Hang on one moment. And everybody see my wrench deck screen here?
Yes.
Excellent. All righty. Hang on one second. Got a notice on an issue. One more moment here. Apologies. Thanks for your patience, everybody. And while I'm pulling this up, there we go. There we go. All right. Can everyone see the deck now? All good? Cool. All right. Thanks everybody for having me. I don't know that I can beat that intro. Whiz, I'll just take and potentially move on. But yes, largely, like kind of said simply, my job for the last probably almost 20 years has been intertwined with a couple things: go-to-market strategies, basically how do we launch new products, and kind of the behavioral sciences of what gets people to buy. I've sat behind a lot of one-way glass. I've launched products. I was one of the co-founders here locally, if you're in Utah, of Lovesac. And I've worked on a lot of new innovation in ConAgra and consumer products. Worked on like Healthy Choice, Orville Redenbacher, stuff like that. And helped launch a lot of what was kind of the crowdfunding for equity space, kind of became a lot of kind of the tools that are being used in crypto and blockchain technologies, investor checkout processes, compliant kind of international platforms for how to do raises in a compliant manner. My company that I co-founded is Wrench AI. Wrench is basically a platform that applies behavioral analytics. And again, its job is to answer, who do you talk to, what do you say, and how do you say it? And so for that reason, we've had to dabble with AI. We did it 5 years ago. It's not a brand new thing to us. We've incorporated rules-based decisioning, machine learning, AI, GPT technologies like large language models that we'll cover today. And had to do so for clients in B2B, B2C, investment, fundraising, all types of fun stuff. So with that, that's kind of like the bona fides. Go ahead and please, throughout this thing, I tend to talk fast when I get excited, and I love this subject matter, so I'm going to inevitably start talking fast. Please stop me. Go ahead, raise your hands. If you have questions in the middle of any screen and you want more information, go for it. I want to start a little bit with kind of what is AI, because this matters in terms of kind of how we apply it. Really kind of quick overview. Artificial intelligence is kind of the umbrella term for basically computer programming that allows us to make human-based decisions. We have the rudimentary version, if you will, that we've been doing, which is like writing code and developing software. We rewrite oversimplified if and then statements. If situation X, then Y. Machine learning, which is another kind of umbrella term, allows us to basically start saying to the software, well, I will give you the input. I will basically give you a bunch of pictures of bananas and a bunch of pictures of other things, bikes, crosswalks, whatever. And then I will give you an answer that says this one's a banana, this one's not an answer. And I'm going to ask you, the software, to start filling in the blanks between the two. Deep learning is kind of another subsector within machine learning, where we're getting and utilizing more unstructured data, images, audio, video, things like that. And then we start getting into kind of generative and discriminative AI. I'm pretty sure 99% of everybody is on the call because of generative AI, where they're looking for large language models. They're looking for ChatGPT tips and things like that. Discriminative, very important, but like when you typically hear of things like machine learning based lead scoring, trying to identify, okay, I've got my CRM out in front of me and I'm trying to predict who is a customer, who is likely to be a customer in a lead score. I'm trying to predict someone's lifetime customer value, or I'm trying to predict if someone's going to churn. That's usually discriminative AI. It's basically you're narrowing down subject matter. You're trying to basically pick from one or a handful of options. Yes, no, true, false, this or that. The generative AI, and very specifically kind of the generative AI is basically where we're generating original text. We're trying to basically mimic the training data that we kind of fed into the model. And that's where GPTs come in. And again, I'm sure it's why most people are on here. So you guys can redirect me if you want, but I'm pretty sure almost everybody wants to talk about GPTs. So these are kind of important just because one, they're probably, you know, as of at least mid-December of last year, really cool, brought everybody to the table as far as like, all right, AI is real. It's very, very interesting. It can do all the cool things like take over the world in Skynet. So not so fast. GPTs are really cool. Generative pre-trained transformers. Those initials matter. Generative meaning, again, this AI model, its job is to basically create the data that it is mimicking in its training data. So if we fed in ChatGPT's instance, the pre-trained or the underlying data, you can see a snapshot of it on the right. The common crawl, which is basically the entire internet in text form. Books, basically everything that's been digitized since Gutenberg and Wikipedia. So in OpenAI's case, they basically read that, they cross-referenced it, broke it into like 50 different words, English words. They cross-referenced that to try to understand it and then plug in what we'll call context for simplicity's sake, 12,000 different dimensions in kind of context to make over 300 billion tokens or word parts that it could basically plug into its model, and then processed it for the equivalent man years of about 300 years of analysis. So that's generative. Its job is to basically take the text that we fed into it and then spit out text that looks like all of the books, the internet, and everything else that it read. And then the layer between those, the transformer, is basically the part of the code that basically takes input X and returns output Y, or A, B, C, D, F. Like it can literally take in those 12,000 different kind of dimensions and make all those different kind of outputs. So the rules essentially that drive that transformer were patterns that it found in the training data. These words were mentioned next to, right? Like the word banana was next to the word lunch, was next to whatever. They included a tiny pinch of randomness to try to recreate a bit of kind of how humans think, where we kind of inject a little bit of novelty. We're not perfectly predictable. And then they basically gave all that data. Here are the words, here's the output. And they basically gave it to 40 different contractors to basically reinforce the answers to be helpful, harmless, and truthful. So they basically scored output until they went, okay, I'm gonna ask you, what is a banana? Okay, all right, banana is a fruit. Okay, that's cool. Yes, helpful, yes. Truthful, yes. Harmless, yes. And that's one of the reasons they've been reinforcing that behavior to say, do more like that. That you basically get a lot of kind of the ChatGPT answers that you do now. It sounds, and they're working towards kind of that assistant type of experience. So a couple of things I really want people to notice here. That is, it is glorified. It's autocomplete on steroids. It is basically taking your prompt, which is like the first half of a sentence for it, and it is trying to finish your sentence for you. Your prompt is basically its input. It is trying to basically say, all right, I read the entire internet, and basically here are the words that come next. It's not sentient. It is not actually smart. If you don't put an input into it, it's not thinking. It's not like evolving. It is a start and stop model. It doesn't know what your hand means or is in a meaningful way. It knows that hand has the word finger next to it, has the word fingernail next to it. And that's what it's actually returning to you. So when it's passing these tests, that's what it's doing. Those tests are published. So in their pattern driven, that text from those tests has been published. It has read that. It's been published in enough scenarios that it's able to actually answer those kind of questions. And then one final little bit of it, that if anybody has played with it for a long period of time, they've noticed that it actually will oftentimes be a little bit finicky. Even though you ask it for a direct answer, a true false question, it will oftentimes inject that randomness and not answer in a true and false answer, or it can even hallucinate where it can make things up. Elon Musk died, I believe, is one of them. So GPTs, big deal, but generating data. doing it based off patterns from data that they've already been fed, and turning that into transformers that they're sending. So really important, because that helps us understand like which AI do we actually want to select and utilize. And when we're going in and, most of the time, most marketers, most teams don't actually know. If you ask them, all right, what information actually really matters to your target audience? I can tell you, one, it varies quite a bit. Two, most people don't actually know. And oftentimes they actually prioritize a lot of things that don't actually matter. And other things like you can see demographics here is up at 42. So what data matters? It'll depend on your product a bit, but this data largely matters. So this output that you see here is one example from a B2C product that my team did for a machine learning, a traditional machine learning model where we were predicting customers. Basically saying, okay, we're going to feed in piles and piles and piles of columns, hundreds, if not thousands of different columns of data, everything from interest, traits, social network, job title, which employer they worked for, what were the culture cues of the employer they worked for. When it comes back, the things that actually oftentimes really drive purchase intent are tied to brand and category affinity, personality traits, the tone of the messages that you're sending them, and their category adoption. It largely means that the best description of how you can basically find your audience is not by just thinking about who I am or whatever else, is by thinking about who your audience is and what their point of view is back to you, right? From their perspective, this is what I mean to them. People almost always talk about demographics, but that's largely because that's what many of the tools that you're using are making available to you. There's obviously exceptions to this, like, certain demographic traits can really matter. If you're an ice cream truck, geographics, it's like, obviously my immediate addressable market matters geography wise. But I can tell you, especially in B2B situations, people tout profession, demographics, and geographics way more than they should. As a reality check, you will find, one, people that love and hate your product, oftentimes both will buy it. Early and late adopters usually have basically the same job title, but another little kind of heads up. Another thing that most people don't know, job titles are actually really disparate nowadays. If you go download 10,000 jobs, or if you look up 10,000 people on LinkedIn right now, 8,000 of them are going to have completely unique job titles that no one else has. So those are both a couple ways that you can kind of watch out for, all right, what data matters, and also kind of how do I pull and what do I actually pull? You want to focus on these kind of number one, first and foremost, behavior-based traits. I'd usually recommend number one, you talk about basically how can we understand more about how they think about our product and our category. And then number two, how can we understand their preferences, the tone, the personality of how we can best communicate to them. Most people, there's some exceptions to this, but most people, for plenty of reasons, just want to be communicated back with the same way that they would communicate to you. They understand kind of how they think and how they talk. They want you to reciprocate. So you go in, you can get those basically saying, all right, what are the tone? How do I describe this? You can ask for sentiment. My team would usually recommend trying to go and segment by adoption curve, meaning I'm going to ask about category behaviors, but I'm going to be asking about early adopters and late adopters. Early adopters being, what are the people that have vision in the space looking for? Late adopters being, hey, what are the people that just kind of have to buy? People that are asking for discounts, people that don't have much education. You want to segment across those behaviors because it's really, really significant in how you approach them. They'll oftentimes spend the same amount of money, but they very much demand different approaches, or they react and respond positively to very different approaches. You want to align your product's functional benefits with your community's desired functional benefits. So again, when we're going through and we're choosing that AI, we're focusing on GPT type stuff. Like number one, if we're just trying to predict a customer, you don't want to use GPT most of the time. You can use it as kind of a training set, but usually if you're narrowing down your data set, you want to focus on a machine learning, kind of a traditional machine learning model. If you're trying to describe your audience, if you're trying to put and understand kind of how they react to specific products, that's where you'd want to use those GPTs more often. And I don't know, did I already cross it? I've got another, make sure I covered it. No, I did cover it. Okay, good. So we have kind of the categories of what we can ask for. We can say, hey, where do people go for this? we can basically go in and get instructions, summarize this text that we can help kind of understand our audience. Give me a list of employers in the industry of XYZ that have descriptions that are similar to this. That type of stuff does work. But oftentimes, again, due to that randomness, it can get really off track really quickly. So if you're going into those and you're wondering, okay, well, how do I ask it? I've messed with this thing a little bit. I'm sure everybody has, but how do I get consistent answers that actually really kind of drive towards my objective? Called prompt design and prompt engineering. And there actually is a little bit of a nuance to it, kind of how do you do it properly? And if you haven't messed with it yet, I've got two little kind of examples for you of kind of, hey, when you're going in and you're asking your questions, because most of these are going to be based on what company or what data you're missing from your prospect data list, right? It's like, oh, I need more information on their industry. I need more information on the category. I need more information on the job description versus the job title. Give part one of that prompt, give instruction, and ideally give it with some reasoning. So oftentimes you'll actually see at the beginning of prompts, act as blank, act as my CFO, act as my salesperson. It basically gives the AI a reference point to say, okay, we're coming from the perspective of, and I want you to zoom in on the set of words that include sales interactions. That basically allows it to get a little bit of a head start on what type of an answer that you're looking for. And then again, you can use that act as salesperson, summarize, describe, give me a list of keywords, describe the industry, things like that. You want to, in many cases, again, avoid fact-based stuff. If you're asking it for statistics and things like that, it's oftentimes a bad thing. It's going to get revenue numbers wrong. It's going to get employee counts wrong. Don't use those because, again, it's returning words that are frequent and similar and next to one another. It doesn't actually understand what revenue actually means. So when it comes back, it's basically giving you the autocomplete version, but it's not actually checking its facts. Part two of your prompt. So you give it your instruction, act as blank, give it your instruction, give examples of good output. I want it to look like this. I want the name of the company, the domain of the company, a description of the company, and an example that the product returns to me. It will get that largely right. And then finally, save your prompts, just because the nature of these, if you can go into ChatGPT, there is an option to select to save your prompt, and make sure that you check and iterate and refresh those. When you start getting examples of good output, you should update and basically deploy those as basically, hey, here's some more examples of what I'm actually looking for. So you actually do get what you're looking for. And then on the right, I've given you a little bit of a cheater prompt. This is basically, hey, how you can basically feed into Bard or feed into ChatGPT. Hey, I'm going to give you a prompt, but I want you to help me evolve my prompt. And you guys can basically just take that text on the right, copy it, paste it, and then start asking your questions. And it will actually help you evolve into a better prompt that gives you more and more of the data that you're looking for your audience. Let's see, additional risks and pitfalls. Biggest one that 99% of the AI experts out there are making right now is they're actually using GPT incorrectly on a lot of these things. They're applying and asking for the wrong data. And the fact that they're getting an answer is fooling them into thinking that they actually have good data, but it's garbage in, garbage out. So make sure that you select and utilize the right tool. And when you do ask questions, sometimes this is a little bit of a headache because people go, oh man, usually when I'm defining my customers as B2B, I'm going, get me a list of SaaS companies with this much revenue and these many employees. It's like you want to append those statistical numbers from other data sources. But it does mean that a lot of that GPT content can still help you a lot and I've actually got a couple of like worksheets below that'll give you some other ideas on other things that you can ask to help understand, like, all right, where is my audience? What networks are they on? What channels? Where are they making their purchases? Things like that are pretty useful for it. Other things and risks and pitfalls, just IP and copyright issues. I won't go into that unless anybody really cares, but just as a heads up, a ton of people are using this tech right now to automate and help them do things like write books, generate art, and just so you know, at least for right now, it's a no-go. Basically, the indicators that we have thus far that you cannot copyright or protect with intellectual property, something that was generated by AI, because by definition, it was generated by its training data. It didn't do anything novel. Prompt jacking. Not many people know about this one, but if you go on to ChatGPT, they now have a marketplace and you can download a bunch of plugins that can help you along your way. I've got a list again of some tools I'll jump into in a minute, but Notion, other tools that help you like write copy and things like that. Just be careful, because when those prompts, those apps, if you will, they're putting a wrapper around their prompt. And oftentimes even you can't see it, but they're saying, all right, act as CFO. I want you to return data that gives a list of companies, but only use the data source that comes from my specific plugin and ignore everything else. They do that oftentimes because they can promote data sources and things that they'll charge you for. So be careful. Sometimes they can actually be nefarious, but you don't realize that there's actually an underlying rule inside of your ChatGPT plugin that's actually changing the direction of the output without you knowing it, and it's in a bad way. Misinformation and invalid data sources. Again, if you ask for revenue numbers, URL statistics, studies, a lot of the time it's making them up. It's making up words that look like they belong next to one another. Like, again, it will make up the URL that it sends you. Do not trust them. There's actually a lawyer that a lot of people on this call have probably seen, where the lawyer basically submitted a lot of his kind of case briefs after having them written by AI and got caught because they were not even founded in reality. He was citing cases that did not exist and he was sanctioned for it. So be careful. And then finally, security and PII. It's against terms of service to upload personally identifiable information. There's a lot of these GPTs and other LLMs that are now saying, hey, be careful, but you should not be and should try to avoid in all cases uploading, hey, here's a list of contacts, go find more people like this. You oftentimes need to kind of narrow down and filter and try to get more and more specific on the people that actually identify as your customer audience, and then describe their behaviors. Where do they work? Where do they, what features are they interested in? What are they buying? And then using that to go basically build your lists as filters or plugging them into lookalike audiences. Let's see. I'm going to shut up now. I was talking a lot, and I hope I didn't go over my time. I have some more that I can absolutely go into if there's not questions. I have, again, a handful of takeaways for what can we ask and how can we ask for it. Other things to help you describe that audience, what they're looking for, how can we replace it, how can we further understand where they hang out. Tech tools, again, go check these out. And if we don't trust those facts, how do we go validate the data? So let me go back up to questions. Just know that those exist, since I'm sure someone's going to ask for them after the call. But questions? I'm going to get a drink really quickly. So the silence may be deafening.
I have a question, Dan, and thanks for presenting.
Sure.
So similar to like what Spencer did, he gave an intro to you at the beginning. I was hosting a webinar and I asked ChatGPT to help me come up with like a introduction for the person who would be the guest speaker on our webinar. And I did it and I was a little bit rushed, and luckily I caught it before, but it said some things like he wrote this or that article in this book, and I went back and was asking like, where did you pull that information? And it was just kind of apologizing. But I guess my question is, do you have any good tips or tricks for fact checking ChatGPT? Is there anything that you can actually like ask it again to kind of recheck things? Because that one is pretty obvious and I was able to catch it, but there may be more subtle things that I just wonder if there's a good way to fact check itself or other ways.
So one, you definitely ask kind of the right questions for it. But what a lot of people think that they'll be doing is, hey, I'm going to go into a ChatGPT prompt and I'm going to type in, hey, give me a list of everybody who likes ice cream in Michigan. Don't do that. What you can do is go take a plugin for ChatGPT, get a filtered list, go purchase one. You can actually even purchase relatively inexpensive ones, right? You don't have different data sources, Zoom info and things like that can be really expensive. You can actually get much lesser expensive ones. You can generate them on like LinkedIn, Sales Navigator, and other places. And you can append the columns that actually help you target and understand where they are, what channels they use, what type of messaging they're looking for. So oftentimes when people kind of put it in their mind's eye, how do I do that kind of fact checking? I go, first things first, if you ask it for like a description of the company, I trust that. If you ask it for, hey, what are the founders or who's the sales director at XYZ company, I don't trust that. It may get one right, it'll get the next one wrong most of the time. And they don't even like returning that data, so they don't incentivize it to deliver it that way. So the combination of the two is largely to say, look, best thing you can do is actually start with a given list. Sometimes that's your prospects inside of your CRM. You can go purchase a list from other places. And then you're using that kind of GPT ability via a plugin, via Clay, via tools like Wrench AI, if you're interested, to basically fill in and help you better understand and define the behaviors of the people in that list, and then sorting and ranking them accordingly, to like lead scoring or other tools that you use to prioritize them. There's still a ton of data sources that you can go to, including just normal kind of search functions. You still have to be careful, even with the kind of search functionality that's integrated into ChatGPT and other kind of tools. They plugged it into Bing and unplugged it quite quickly. But there's still actually quite a bit of kind of dated older data sources that have examples of like kind of directly sourced data. Even a lot of things like Wikipedia actually have a decent amount of wiki data where they're tying in a lot of kind of business and company metrics as well if you're doing B2C stuff. But I would definitely check all of these places because again, like as an example too, you can basically take and plug in a list of product reviews, and the GPT technologies are very good for saying, hey, can you summarize this list of reviews and give me a good breakdown of the pros and cons of what features work and what features don't. And that actually helps you understand a lot of the behaviors about your actual customers, where, when, and how they were purchasing it. And when you build that behavior profile, now you basically have kind of that list of, all right, what are their pain points? Who, what, where, why, how are they? Can I use those as lookalike audiences or search functions inside of social networks to figure out what like ideas to track, hashtags to follow, and other people to respond to in kind of social scenarios or lists. So bit of a tirade there, but
No, that's helpful. Thanks, Sam.
awesome. Thank you. Anyone else?
I was just wondering if you could tell us more about your beta testing needs.
Beta testing needs. So
that was on your last slide. That's why we're one of your slides.
Oh,
yeah.
So yeah, let me see if I can show you one. A lot of the kind of text that we use and build is basically a combination of AI. It's machine learning. Again, it's GPT and kind of rules based. It's all combined. It's a executive decision-making tools. Our goal there is because not every problem is kind of built. Everyone right now, that seems to be kind of the trend that everybody is going, okay, one size kind of fits all. I'd love to see if I can find one here for you. But we've basically built a tool that is a plugin that will basically go on LinkedIn if you're doing social sales and automatically start to break down a lot of this data. Do you guys see my screen? Can you guys see the LinkedIn thing?
Yeah.
So this basically will take a lot of the insights that we built, where we'll basically go in and say, okay, cool. I want you to actually take the text that's on this page, look at the authored text, actually very telling. The exclamation points, the jargon, the nuance, the about us, this stuff again is actually really rich for behavior profiling and understand, like, anyone can fake a job title. It's very difficult, like say, to fake sounding like you're a surgeon, right? They have their own jargon, they have their own acronyms, right? Like, pretty hard to fake some of that stuff. And so one of the best places that you can find kind of the digital exhaust that indicates your customers, and very specifically the customers that care the most about your product, is their jargon use. Do they use our acronyms? Do they have our slang? Like literally we're checking down to do they have the number of syllables? Do the number of syllables increase or decrease when they talk about our subject matter? So what this plugin, this beta is a plugin that works on right now just LinkedIn, but it's going into other places. And it actually breaks down a lot of those to actually discern a lot of those behaviors for you. Understanding someone's personality, the tone, and the type of kind of campaigns they're more likely to respond to based on cues in their word choice and their job description, professional experience, and even cross-referencing that with basically some of the indicators of your own product. So you can in Wrench type in a description of your product. I'm selling ice cream. it will automatically rescore set up to basically understand and recognize people that use that jargon, even if you didn't list it in the description of your company, and then assign values to it so that you can literally kind of start to rank populations and understand, okay, who is out there. Let me show you actually an example of it, but here is one of Wrench basically checking its own user population against in-context insights. So every dot here is another person, and every person here, it's breaking down and basically saying, all right, in-context insights, what does Ian say? Here are kind of like the semantic matches that basically compare Wrench's description, our behaviors, to their behaviors, pulls their personalities, and actually can use that to generate fully personalized content for that person. So one, Susan, thank you for asking. So I got a free plug out of that. I appreciate that. But the tech there is to automate a lot of this experience. You can do it on a DIY version, like I just showed you. You can have a product like Wrench or Clay, or, there's superpowers. There's other tools out there that will kind of do it for you as well. So just depending on your appetite. Our job, we do it a bit for you, and we try to run some of the data in the background to figure out what should we incorporate and how should we include it. So again, thank you, Susan. Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Susan. Maxwell, you've got your hand up. What's up, man?
Dan, you used a B2C example. Do you have B2B examples using some of these tools, or are you
Very much
finding
so.
that
Actually,
some of the profiles are similar? Yeah, go ahead.
It works both in B2C and B2B, but actually, from my perspective, B2B works better just because B2B data is actually like a lot easier to come by. B2B data, like oftentimes you're dealing with things where people like, as an example, nobody really hides their LinkedIn profile. There's nothing, they want you to know those things about them. It's actually like the best version of themselves in many cases. So not only does it work in B2B, it actually works much better in B2B. The screen that you're seeing here is only B2B. Most of like our clients are B2B as well, just because some of the costs of the tech, right? If you're selling ice cream cones and like your average sale is only $1 or $2, it can be just the economics may not make sense. So B2B is actually very, very, very more common than anything else. And it's industry agnostic too. You can use these methods in anything.
Are you finding users in the marketing team or like on the sales team? Is this like for direct individual outreach or more campaign driven outreach?
You can do it for both. It absolutely will work for both. Our stuff does absolutely work for both sales and marketing, because when we switch and start assigning things to a numerical value, we can basically aggregate data and basically build personas on it, kind of like a pivot table in a CSV or an Excel spreadsheet. We can basically do, here's the person, here's their behavior assigned to kind of like, here's how much they talk about ice cream, 0 to 100. And then you can aggregate and bin that data to start to get kind of overall metrics like you see here. This is kind of like hey, for your entire population, here's what we would say. If you want to look at each of the individual personas within it, you have kind of the share of the population and some data that's specific to them. So it'll work for a marketing and sales team. Kind of one of the cool things that generally speaking, this tech and using these methods lets you do is collaborate with marketing, sales, and product. You guys can finally start working from the same sheet of music, so to speak, and saying, okay, we found this is how we describe them. They can take and modify your prompts if you like, to kind of work and give you like, if you're on sales, a 360 degree of a profile. Marketing team can aggregate the data, average the data, pivot the data, and turn that into kind of an aggregate profile or something that they've kind of binned. So it'll definitely work for both. Comes in handy for the.
And you're just providing the tool a CSV or a list or some other download from a different database.
Yes, you can upload as little as just an email address. If you're starting with those lists, again, you guys are usually pulling them from Salesforce and LinkedIn, Zoom info, things like that. So your queues there are obviously like what we do. We will go and basically just plug into data services where we'll just say like, all right, LinkedIn is this person on LinkedIn right now. Twitter, same thing. You can look them up based on that contact info, but you can also, don't underestimate what you can do by looking them up based off their email domain. You can actually get quite a bit of information, even just understanding where the domain actually goes. You can use a lot of that to understand like the company, the domain, the description of the company, the industry of the company, the technological subscriptions. If you're a SaaS company, hey, are they subscribed to a competitive product? There's a lot of stuff that you can pull there. But yeah, you can absolutely start with as little as an email, a phone number, a Twitter profile, a LinkedIn URL. Any one of the above is enough to actually start a pretty significant enrichment and 360 profile process. So yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, Dan. This has been informative and super cool. If people want to learn more about working with you and Wrench, what's the best way to get connected?
Yeah, please go ahead and hit me up. Anyone has any questions or anything else, we'll make the deck and the worksheets available to anybody that's been on the call today. I'm Dan at Wrench AI if you want to reach out directly. If you want to test and try out like the sales plugin that you saw, just shoot me a message, subject matter Midday Connect beta if you can. Follow us on LinkedIn, follow me on LinkedIn. I'm Dan Baird on LinkedIn is my URL there. But please, any thoughts, questions? And again, the deck will be available for you too. So you can make use of anything that we showed you here.
It's great. Thanks so much, Dan. Thanks everyone
Awesome.
for coming out.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.